I've always loved the sound of rain. There's something soothing about the rhythmic patter against the windows, especially in a house like this, old, wooden, and full of memories. Tonight, the rain started softly, almost as if it were trying not to disturb me. I was curled up in my room upstairs, surrounded by notes and my laptop, struggling to meet a deadline for work. Freelancing wasn't exactly my dream job, but it paid the bills, and right now, that's all that mattered. This house, my childhood home, has its quirks. The creaks in the floorboards, the occasional groan of the pipes, it's all part of its charm, or so I tell myself. But tonight, something felt different. As the rain grew heavier, I noticed a sound that didn't quite belong. At first, I dismissed it, a faint scratching sound, like a branch brushing against the side of the house. I glanced at the window but saw nothing unusual. Still, the noise lingered. I tried to focus on my work, typing half-heartedly as the unease settled in. The scratching continued, rhythmic and deliberate, almost like footsteps. I shook my head, laughing softly to myself. "You're just tired," I muttered. But when the sound shifted, seeming to follow me as I moved to the kitchen for a glass of water, my stomach knotted. It was as if something, or someone, was tracing my steps from above. The rain grew louder, masking the sound briefly, but the moment the downpour lightened, the scratching returned. This time, it was directly above me. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. "It's probably just an animal," I whispered to the empty room, though the words did little to reassure me. Still, I grabbed a flashlight and went to check the windows again. Nothing. Just the rain. When I sat back down, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The house felt colder, the shadows longer. I considered calling someone, but who? It's not like I could explain, "Hey, I think something's on my roof," without sounding ridiculous. Instead, I convinced myself to push through the night, blaming my imagination for the strange sounds. But deep down, I knew something was wrong. As I returned to my laptop, trying to refocus, the scratching stopped. The silence was almost worse than the noise. I let out a shaky breath and told myself it was over. But just as I began typing again, a sharp, deliberate knock echoed from the ceiling above me. I wasn't imagining it anymore. The knock echoed in my ears long after it had stopped. I sat there, frozen, gripping the edge of my desk as if that might anchor me to reality. My breath came in short, shallow gasps, and the house felt impossibly still. For a few minutes, I stayed glued to my chair, straining to hear anything else. The rain continued to beat against the windows, but that sound, familiar and safe, was no longer comforting. All I could hear was the silence above. I didn't want to believe it. I didn't even want to think it. But the memory forced its way in, unbidden. The man on the roof. Every town has its ghost stories, but ours always seemed different. The legend of the man on the roof had been around as long as I could remember, whispered in hushed tones during sleepovers or campouts. Parents dismissed it as nonsense, of course, and for most of my life, I had too. It was just a scary story meant to keep kids from wandering around alone at night. But the details were always so specific. They said he came during storms, always when the rain was loud enough to drown out the sound of his arrival. He'd perch on your roof, watching, waiting. No one ever saw his face, just glimpses of a long, thin shadow, or the faint outline of a figure crouched in the darkness. Some claimed to hear scratching, others knocking, like someone testing for a way inside. And if you looked for him, if you tried to confront him, you were never seen again. I had always laughed at it. A shadowy figure on the roof? Really? But now, sitting alone in this old house, with the echo of that knock still fresh in my mind, I wasn't laughing anymore. I grabbed my phone, needing to hear another human voice, but the signal was weak. Of course it was. This house, nestled just on the edge of town, had always been a dead zone during storms. I stared at the screen, willing the signal bar to reappear, when another memory surfaced. It had been years ago, not long after my family moved here. I was maybe 8 or 9. My parents were hosting a dinner party, and I had snuck upstairs, bored out of my mind. As I played with my toys, I heard it, a faint scratching, like nails against wood. I ran downstairs, crying about a monster on the roof, but my dad just laughed, saying it was probably raccoons. Later that night, though, I overheard him talking to one of the guests. His voice was low, serious. Strange how many people claim to hear that during storms. Must be the wind, right? I hadn't thought about it in years, but now, it felt like a piece of a puzzle I didn't want to solve. The scratching started again, softer this time, almost tentative. My heart thudded painfully against my ribs. I wanted to run upstairs, grab my flashlight, and prove to myself it was nothing. But what if it wasn't? What if the stories were true? The storm grew louder, and for a moment, I thought maybe it was all in my head. Maybe the sound was just branches scraping against the house, amplified by my overactive imagination. But then, a louder thud echoed, followed by another deliberate knock, closer this time. I had to know. Against my better judgment, I grabbed the flashlight from the kitchen drawer. The beam was faint, the batteries weak, but it would have to do. My hands trembled as I climbed the stairs, every step creaking beneath my weight. By the time I reached the landing, my breath was coming in shallow gasps. I pointed the flashlight toward the attic door. It was closed, as it always was. But the scratches seemed to come from just beyond it. "Hello?" I called out, my voice cracking. No response. Just the steady rhythm of the rain, and the scratching. I stood at the bottom of the attic door, my flashlight trembling in my hand. My mind raced with possibilities, each more absurd than the last. "It's just an animal," I whispered to myself, but the words sounded hollow, even to my own ears. The scratching was too deliberate, too precise, like someone, or something, was trying to get my attention. My fingers hovered over the attic door's latch. I didn't want to open it. Every instinct screamed for me to go back downstairs, lock myself in my room, and wait for morning. But something deep inside urged me forward. Maybe it was curiosity, maybe stubbornness, or maybe it was the gnawing fear that whatever was up there wouldn't stay confined for long. I unlatched the door and pushed it open with a creak that seemed to echo louder than the storm. The beam of my flashlight cut through the darkness, illuminating old boxes and dusty furniture. The air smelled stale, a mix of wood and neglect. Nothing moved. The scratching had stopped. I let out a shaky breath, stepping inside. My flashlight swept across the attic, revealing nothing unusual. Just shadows. The rain hammered against the roof above, making it hard to hear anything else. For a moment, I felt almost foolish. "See? It's just your imagination," I muttered, trying to convince myself. Then, as I turned to leave, the beam of my flashlight caught something near the far corner. Long, jagged marks carved into the wooden beams. They were deep, almost as if made by claws. My stomach twisted into a knot. No animal I knew could do that. I backed away, my pulse quickening, and nearly tripped over a box. My flashlight wavered, and for a split second, I thought I saw a shadow move near the roofline. I whipped the light back toward it, but there was nothing there. Just the empty attic. Still, the feeling of being watched was overwhelming, like unseen eyes were boring into the back of my neck. I bolted down the stairs, slamming the attic door shut behind me. My chest heaved as I leaned against it, trying to catch my breath. The house felt heavier now, oppressive, as if it were holding its breath along with me. I needed to call someone, anyone, but when I grabbed my phone, the signal was still dead. Figures. The lights flickered again, casting eerie shadows across the walls. I made my way back to the living room, hoping to find some comfort in the familiar, but the unease followed me like a second skin. Every sound, every creak of the old house, made me jump. That's when I saw them. The marks. They were faint but unmistakable, scratches trailing down the wall near the staircase. I hadn't noticed them earlier, but now, they stood out like a warning. My stomach churned. Whatever had been in the attic, it wasn't staying there. The storm outside intensified, rattling the windows and drowning out the smaller noises of the house. But as I stared at those scratches, I swore I heard something else. A faint, deliberate tapping. It was coming from above again, but not the attic. This time, it was the ceiling directly over the living room. My flashlight beam wavered as I pointed it upward, my hands trembling so badly I could hardly keep the light steady. "Hello?" My voice was barely a whisper. The tapping stopped. For a moment, all I could hear was the rain. Then, without warning, there was a loud thud, followed by another, and another, as if something heavy was pacing back and forth on the roof. I stumbled backward, the flashlight slipping from my grip and clattering to the floor. The darkness swallowed me, and my breath hitched as the sound grew louder. I scrambled to retrieve the flashlight, my fingers fumbling over the cold metal. When I finally managed to turn it back on, I aimed it toward the ceiling. The thud stopped. The silence was deafening. And then, just as I thought it was over, a single, deliberate knock echoed from the front door. The knock at the door sent a jolt of terror through my entire body. My first instinct was to run upstairs, hide in a closet, do anything but go toward that door. But something kept me frozen in place. I stared at the door, my breath caught in my throat, listening. The knock didn't come again, but the silence that followed was worse. I couldn't stay like this, paralyzed with fear, so I forced myself to move. My legs felt like lead as I approached the door. I told myself that maybe it was a neighbor, someone seeking shelter from the storm. Maybe it was just a random visitor. But deep down, I knew better. I reached the door, my hand trembling as it hovered over the lock. For a brief moment, I debated opening it. Then, I leaned closer and looked through the peephole. Nothing. The porch was empty, rain pouring down in heavy sheets. The only thing visible was the flickering glow of the porch light struggling against the storm. I exhaled shakily, feeling a small, fleeting sense of relief. Maybe I was imagining things. Maybe the storm and the strange sounds had gotten to me. But as I stepped back, something caught my eye. On the other side of the peephole, there was a faint movement, just a shadow, shifting slightly. My heart raced. I leaned forward again, squinting through the tiny glass. The porch still appeared empty, but the shadow remained, faint and unnatural, as if it wasn't cast by anything I could see. I stumbled backward, my pulse pounding in my ears. That's when I heard it, the sound I dreaded most. The scratching. This time, it came from the ceiling above me, slow and deliberate, like nails being dragged across the wooden beams. I backed away from the door, clutching the flashlight tightly. "Who's there?" My voice was barely audible over the storm. No response. The scratching grew louder, closer, as if it was moving from the ceiling to the walls around me. My mind raced with panic. I needed to get out of this house, but where would I go? The storm outside was relentless, and I had no idea what was waiting for me beyond the door. I turned toward the staircase, thinking maybe I could barricade myself in one of the upstairs rooms. But as I took the first step, the lights in the house flickered violently before going out completely, plunging me into darkness. My flashlight became my only source of light, the narrow beam cutting through the oppressive blackness. I shone it toward the staircase, but something made me stop. At the top of the stairs, just for a split second, I thought I saw movement, a shadow darting out of sight. I swallowed hard, my legs refusing to carry me any closer. The scratching returned, now coming from the walls on either side of me. It was everywhere, surrounding me, closing in. I couldn't tell if it was real or if my mind was playing tricks on me. Then I saw it. A figure crouched on the roof outside, visible through the large window at the end of the hallway. The rain blurred the details, but I could see enough: a long, twisted body, arms too long for its frame, and glowing eyes that pierced through the darkness. It wasn't human. It couldn't be. My breath hitched, and I stumbled backward, nearly falling as I scrambled to get away. The figure moved, its shadow darting out of view as if it knew I had seen it. The knocking returned, this time from the attic door. 3 loud, deliberate bangs that reverberated through the house. I turned and ran, the flashlight's beam bouncing wildly as I made my way toward the kitchen. My only thought was to get out. The back door. There was a spare key in the drawer, and if I could make it to the forest behind the house, maybe I'd have a chance. The knocking followed me, growing louder and more frantic, as if the thing was chasing me. I grabbed the key with shaking hands and fumbled with the lock. Every second felt like an eternity. Finally, the door swung open, and I was hit by the cold rain and wind. I didn't stop to think. I ran, my bare feet slipping on the wet grass as I sprinted toward the tree line. The forest loomed ahead, dark and foreboding, but it was my only option. Behind me, I heard the door slam shut. Then came the sound of something heavy landing on the porch, followed by the unmistakable scratching. It was following me. The rain pelted down, soaking through my clothes as I stumbled into the forest. My flashlight flickered weakly, barely illuminating the path ahead. The trees loomed like silent sentinels, their branches twisting together to form a canopy that blocked out what little light the storm offered. Each step sent sharp pains through my bare feet, but I didn't dare slow down. Behind me, I could still hear it. The scratching. It wasn't distant anymore, it was closer, deliberate, as if it was dragging itself through the wet grass, following my every move. I didn't look back. I couldn't. The forest floor was uneven, roots and rocks catching my feet as I tried to navigate deeper into the trees. The sound of the rain against the leaves masked the quieter noises, but every now and then, I caught it, the faint crunch of something heavy moving through the underbrush. I turned the flashlight off, hoping the darkness would hide me, though it left me completely blind. My breath came in shallow gasps as I pressed myself against the trunk of a tree, trying to calm the hammering of my heart. The scratching sound had stopped again, replaced by an eerie silence that made my skin crawl. Seconds passed. Then minutes. I thought, maybe, I had lost it. But then I heard it, soft, almost imperceptible at first. A low, guttural sound, like a growl, resonating through the forest. It sent chills down my spine. The air around me felt colder, heavier, and the silence grew suffocating. I held my breath, straining to hear where the sound was coming from. It was everywhere and nowhere, surrounding me like a predator circling its prey. The rain seemed to lessen for a moment, and that's when I saw it, a shadow moving between the trees, impossibly fast. I broke into a run, my feet slipping in the mud as I pushed deeper into the forest. My lungs burned, my body screaming for rest, but I couldn't stop. The shadow was following me, darting from tree to tree, just on the edge of my vision. Up ahead, I saw a clearing. My heart leapt with hope, thinking it might lead to the road or somewhere I could hide. But as I broke through the trees, I stopped dead in my tracks. The clearing wasn't empty. In the center stood a tree, massive and gnarled, with deep grooves etched into its bark. At its base, scattered like offerings, were small objects, trinkets, broken toys, and other things I couldn't make out in the dim light. But the most unsettling part was the ground. It was covered in those same claw marks I had seen in the attic. I backed away, my flashlight flickering on instinctively. The beam landed on the tree trunk, and that's when I saw them, two glowing eyes staring back at me from the branches above. It was here. I couldn't move. My legs felt rooted to the ground as those glowing eyes stared down at me from the tree. My breath hitched, and I could feel the cold rain seeping into my skin, but it was nothing compared to the icy dread clutching my chest. The thing didn't move at first, it just watched, as if savoring my fear. Then, with an unnatural, jerking motion, it descended. It didn't climb like an animal. It seemed to glide down the tree, its limbs moving in ways that shouldn't have been possible. The closer it got, the more details came into focus. Its limbs were long and skeletal, with jagged claws that gleamed even in the faint light of my dying flashlight. Its face, or what I thought was its face, was shrouded in shadows, but those eyes burned, unblinking and predatory. I stumbled back, my feet catching on roots as I tried to distance myself. My flashlight flickered again, casting the clearing into complete darkness for a heartbeat before sputtering back on. In that brief instant, it had moved. It was closer now, crouched low to the ground like it was ready to pounce. The sound of its claws dragging against the dirt filled the silence. "Please," I whispered, though I didn't know what I was begging for. Mercy? A miracle? Anything but the inevitability of what was coming. The thing tilted its head, as if considering me. Then, it lunged. I screamed, throwing myself to the side, barely avoiding its grasp. My flashlight flew from my hand, the beam spinning wildly as it landed in the mud. The last thing I saw before the light gave out completely was its shadow enveloping me. And then, nothing.